Hi there and welcome to a special holiday edition of Power and Politics. I'm Vassy Kapelos. Today we're bringing you our picks for the top 5 political controversies of 2019. Helping us count them down is the Power Panel. Everyone joins us from Toronto today. Amanda Arao of Pomp and Circumstance, journalist and host of the Safe Space podcast, Vicky Machama is next to her. Not too far away, Hill and Knowlton's Melissa Lantsman and Brad Levine of Council Public Affairs. Let's get started on the list no one wants to be part of. The top 5 Canadian political controversies of 2019.
I think she has quite good arguments on her side. One, political involvement by comments from Donald Trump. 2, there's an extraterritorial aspect to her case.
If I were Prime Minister, I would fire John McCallum.
Making a change would not help release those Canadians a day sooner.
I'll just say my statement speaks for itself, and I'm going back to China tomorrow.
The events of the last 72 hours and Ambassador McCallum's comments went way over the line.
The central job of an ambassador is to represent accurately the government's position. John didn't do that, and that is why his position was untenable.
The best thing that Trump could do would be to say that he's no longer seeking to extradite Meng Wanzhou.
Mr. McCallum does not speak in the name of the government of Canada.
The number 5 political controversy of 2019, you may have guessed it, former Canadian Ambassador John McCallum's comments on China. Specifically, as you heard, McCallum weighed in on the extradition case against Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou in early 2019. His comments eventually led to his removal as Canada's ambassador to China, but he didn't stop talking. In July, Mr. McCallum gave an interview to the South China Post in which he appeared to warn Beijing against any more punitive trade measures, suggesting that it would help elect a conservative government in the fall election in Canada. That forced the Trudeau government to disavow those comments. How risky was it for Mr. McCallum to make his initial comment about Meng's extradition case, and why would he have felt at liberty to continue to give interviews regarding Canada's relationship with China months after being removed as ambassador? I'm going to start with Vicky. Vicky, your thoughts on this top 5, number 5.
It was a striking departure for the Canadian government to be saying some of the things that Mr. McCallum was saying. But as he's continued to speak, it was become incredibly clear that he wasn't speaking for the Canadian government. He was often speaking for John McCallum.
Amanda, what do you think? How troublesome was this for the Liberals when it happened?
John, what happened to John McCallum? It's like he had 2 decades of service where he was widely regarded as a really successful politician, somebody who served as the immigration minister, who ushered in 39,000 Syrian refugees. And then he's kind of like, and we all have one, like a family member or a friend who just keeps talking when he shouldn't be talking at all. And it's almost like he got to a point in his career where he was kind of like, well, you know what? I'm just going to say what I want to say.
Right.
I'm going to say it when I want to say it. Was it troublesome for the Liberal government? Of course it was. This is the biggest diplomatic issue that we were facing this year, and they had to contend with John McCallum's comments on the side.
Brad, what do you think?
Well, I think that that's right. I think it speaks to the challenge that some may have by going from elected official, a politician, to a diplomat. And I mean, a member of cabinet shouldn't have been saying those things, but he started those remarks speaking to the Chinese language media in his former riding in Markham, Ontario. So I think that there was an inability for Mr. McCallum maybe to disconnect between his previous job as a constituency MP and a cabinet minister in a government and being a diplomat, especially one with such a complex file as the Canada-China file, and it obviously didn't prove to be a very good mix. It created all the trouble that Amanda suggests for the Trudeau government at the time, and we still have unresolved issues that flow from that. Just passing the 1-year anniversary of the arrest of Meng, we still have 2 Canadians in prison. Not that Mr. McCallum's remarks, I think, didn't help that situation at all, but certainly the challenge between going from an elected politician with one set of a lens at looking at world issues to a diplomat who should be looking at the world lens through a different set of glasses.
Melissa, how did you view it?
Look, I think Canadians were unclear whether Mr. McCallum was Canada's ambassador to China or whether it was the reverse, whether he was a Chinese ambassador just sitting in China. At first, I thought it might be a trial balloon, but then the comments got so crazy that that it couldn't, that couldn't be it. And I think Amanda's right, that weird uncle that sort of talks out of turn. But what remains clear, and I think Brad touched on this, is that the government still has no idea what to do on the China file, and it hasn't figured out whether China is an ally or an enemy, and it remains to be seen how they handle this relationship next year.
Yeah, Vicky, this is not an easy file for this government. It hasn't been an easy file for previous governments either, but especially this one, given Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who of course have been detained for a year.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, a massive challenge to figure out what to do next, and having to, remove John McCallum from the post really put them in the lurch, especially with solving the detention of these gentlemen. It never helps to have an interim ambassador in place when you are in a situation of crisis, especially when two of your citizens are being held. But they have found an ambassador in Dominic Barton, and the real question is whether or not Barton's experience in China will lend itself to resolving some of these tensions.
Amanda, last word to you.
Well, despite John McCallum's comments, which were completely offside, you have to remember that John McCallum was actually very well liked in China. That doesn't change the fact that the government will find itself in a very difficult position under one of the most sensitive and trying conversations that they're going to have with Canadians, and that is what will happen to these two Michaels in 2020.
4 cents on every dollar that we spend.
23,000 children languishing on a wait list as a result of the previous Liberal administration was unfair, unequitable, and unsustainable, and it was disgusting.
We have to find small efficiencies across the board. It's not sustainable.
If the solution is to defer and delay these inevitable decisions that must be made, then I think that's an abdication of leadership.
At the end of the day, the taxpayers are going to be better off.
Day after day, night after night, weekend after weekend, more letters and envelopes and emails and smoke signals come out of there saying that there's cuts to everything.
Every mayor I've talked to says, I know there's savings, we just need more time. So we're going to give the mayors more time, we're going to work with them.
I just want families out there to know right across Ontario, but particularly in the GTA, but right across Ontario, that we are focused on getting a deal that keeps their family, keeps their kid in class.
I just don't have the funds to be able to press that pause button. It's just not possible.
The fourth top political controversy of 2019, Ontario Premier Doug Ford's cuts and in some cases subsequent reversals on everything from autism funding to the size of his cabinet to reversing a decision to cancel a Francophone university to smaller class sizes and fewer teaching positions in Ontario schools. Amanda, I'll start off with you on this one. How big of a deal was this to the Ford government?
It was a huge deal. I mean, the hallmark of a government that is completely out of control, has no idea of what they're doing and no idea of what they stand for, it has to be the Ford government right now over the last year. I mean, you take a government who came in on a wave, a majority, promising savings and then taking a slash to virtually every program that provided a social service and taking an attack on parents became what he really became the laughingstock in Ontario. But what I find really interesting about this story is the fact that it is the result of parents, a public outcry of families on everything from children's aid funding to autism funding to education, which has made this Ford government have to walk back some of these cuts. So while they criticized the former government, the Wynne government, for the programs they had in place, they've now had to walk back their cuts and return to the funding models that they so desperately criticized.
I'll get Melissa to respond to that one.
Well, one man's walkbacks are another man's investments. And if you're going to have, a challenging first year, which I think inevitably most would agree the Ford government had, it's best that it's done early in the term. And right now, there is an opportunity, and an opportunity that's being seized by the Ford government to play that role in the federation of let's make nice with the federal government because we promised Ontarians with a resounding majority majority, that we are going to get things done. We're going to get things built like a subway. We're going to end hallway health care. That's going to take investment from the federal government. And Justin Trudeau needs Doug Ford. Doug Ford needs Justin Trudeau. And there's no better place to be as an Ontario premier than in that position right now.
Well, he certainly needed him in the campaign, and it seemed to work for the Prime Minister during the campaign, at least. Brad, what do you think, especially on this idea of the rebrand or the reset and the idea being put forth by the Premier that he can act as a unifier? How does this play out in 2020 from where you sit?
Yeah, I mean, it could. I think the challenge that Doug Ford has is that he became leader of the Ontario PC Party quite late in the cycle before the election campaign. He won the majority. But, you know, there's not much grounding him. That is, what does he believe in? He said at the clips, I believe in saving the taxpayers some money, but then he's walked back a lot of those decisions. It almost seems like he makes a decision, gets pressure, whether it's from parents or from the Francophone community or wherever, and he retreats. That makes it very erratic, very difficult to take seriously. Obviously, it's been a very challenging year. And in fact, one point that has been is that he had to fire his finance minister in the first year. That is very rare.
Vic Fedeli replaced by Rod Phillips.
In Canadian politics. Whether or not the reboot works we'll see. But Mr. Ford is so desperate to kind of define himself, to brand himself, that he's picked up the mantle coming out of the federal election. That is, there is tensions within the Federation, and can he be the big unifier? Now, Ontario has a tradition of the premiers playing that unifying role, but nothing suggests that Mr. Ford, as an individual, is well suited for that role. We will see. The Council of the Federation seemed to go very well. Whether that was Mr. Ford's or Premier Mose, who was the chair of the Federation, or Mr. Kenney, who did a lot of the organizing around that, I don't know who should take the credit, but I'm reluctant to give it to Mr. Ford. Whether the rebrand works in 2020, it's far too early to predict.
Vicky, what do you think?
I mean, I think Doug Ford ran for premier, but he's always only wanted one job, which was mayor of Toronto. And he's as good as that as he was ever going to be a good mayor of Toronto. He's capricious. His whims are never followed. They're not backed by policy. When he wants to find savings, they're often savings at the cost of spending more later or having to readjust and respend and make that money. There's no question about Doug Ford as a unifier. We have a long history of Doug Ford in Toronto failing to unify anybody but himself and his desire for power. That is the Doug Ford legacy and the story that's ongoing. A reset is ambitious, but I don't know that this is the man to put one into effect.
Do you think the people surrounding him could, let me just quickly follow up with you, do you think the people surrounding him could have an impact in that direction?
No, because I think ultimately he's the premier and he has to make the decisions. And often Doug Ford describes making decisions from his gut. And you can see how there's a shortfall between what someone instinctively feels to be true and what needs to happen.
Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Her presence in cabinet should actually speak for itself.
Were you pressured by the Prime Minister's office?
Still working with my lawyer.
If she felt that she had received pressure, it was her obligation, her responsibility to come to talk to me, and she did not do that in the fall. And she continued to choose to serve in this government as Veterans Affairs Minister when I made a cabinet shuffle.
Privilege and confidentiality are not mine to waive, and I hope that I have the opportunity to speak my truth.
On January the 7th, 2019, the Prime Minister phoned the Minister of Justice and Attorney General to inform her that he was shuffling cabinet and that she would be part of that shuffle.
I received a call from the Prime Minister and was informed I was being shuffled out of my role as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. I believe the reason was because of the SNC matter. They denied this to be the case.
I strongly maintain, as I have from the beginning, that I and my staff always acted appropriately and professionally. It's become clear that Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Dr. Philpott can no longer remain part of our Liberal team.
In this election, I will be running as an independent candidate.
I want to thank the Ethics Commissioner for his report. And even though I disagree with some of his conclusions, I fully accept this report and take responsibility for everything that happened.
The number 3 of our top 5 political controversies is the SNC-Lavalin affair. SNC-Lavalin was investigated and charged with bribery back in 2015 in connection with its business dealings in Libya. It had been pushing for a deferred prosecution agreement. That case led to discussions between the Prime Minister's office and the former Attorney General and Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould, which in turn, stay with me, led to one of this year's biggest political stories, the shuffling of Wilson-Raybould out of that cabinet role to Veterans Affairs, her subsequent resignation, and then dismissal from the Liberal caucus. That led to an ethics investigation into how it was all handled by Prime Minister Trudeau. The investigation found that he had indeed violated ethics rules. Now, a division of SNC-Lavalin has pleaded guilty to a charge of fraud over $5,000 and will pay a $280 million fine. Melissa, I'm going to start with you. How big of a deal was this for the federal government, for the Trudeau government?
This was like a textbook case of how to do every single thing wrong in issues management at every single given opportunity. And it started with, denial and lies, and it ended with a kangaroo court of a committee hearing. It resulted in a minister leaving cabinet to run as an independent, to now win, to continue to maybe cause problems from the government. The fact of the matter is that this one's not over. And every time we see SNC come back into the news, we're going to have questions about this government and its conduct. And what it really did is it speaks to the brand damage of the Liberals, because maybe they can withstand one SNC. We saw that. They currently hold government. But certainly they can't withstand another or anything that looks and smells like this.
Amanda, I'll get you to respond to that. And also just to the specific question of how big of a dent in that brand, quote unquote, did this make?
I mean, it was bad. We were talking about this for weeks and weeks and months, and I remember being on like week 9 and thinking, come on, there has to be.
I remember you Skyping from like Hawaii or something for it. Yeah,
we Skyped in for this
dedicated,
one. Yeah, it was bad. Now, was it take down the government bad? Well, it turns out it wasn't, but it cost them some of their key advisors. It cost them cabinet ministers. It cost them credibility. It cost them part of their reputation. They for sure took a brand hit. The Prime Minister himself took a brand hit, and those numbers showed themselves to be true for many months. It was remarkable that actually the Liberal government was able to claw its way out of that and present a case to Canadians that they were compelled by and willing to vote for in the election, because as far as controversies go, this one was up there.
Vicky, what do you think?
I mean, I think it was controversial, and a lot of it raised some massive and important questions about how the role of Justice Minister functions. What are the players of, what role does the political player class have to do with all of that? But at the same time, I can guarantee you for the many weeks that the media and the political class talked about it, I never heard a single person out in the real world mention it. And I guarantee that I don't know that many people walked into the ballot box in October thinking about this at the top of their mind. However, for a number of Indigenous communities, especially people who support Jody Wilson-Raybould, this was emblematic of a number of things. I think Michael Wernick's role in all of this is really understated, because the space he occupied in politics and in governing Indigenous lives for a long time, and then now close to the Prime Minister, that was concerning. But on a day-to-day basis, it was one of those conversations that I would watch on this channel and then never hear ever again.
That's interesting that you say that, because I would say of all my time covering politics, it generated the most reaction from people that I'd ever, and I know that you would probably assume that's only people that watch, and I always judge it by what are my sisters saying, and they were just sort of like, this is weird, what's up with the Prime Minister? They weren't into the details like we were, but it did generate, I will say honestly, the most reaction of anything that I have ever covered, at least as far as my inbox goes or that kind of thing. But I take your point. Brad, what do you think? How big of a deal was this?
Well, I mean, it was a significant event for the Liberals within the last year. It did not cost them many seats. They were reduced to a minority, but it wasn't, as has been stated, it wasn't government killing in that sense. I think one of the reasons why it got the reaction that you're describing is it played into a whole bunch of different things. One is it was a Quebec-based firm. And I think that the reaction in Quebec was different from the reaction what you heard in Western Canada. Whereas in Western Canada, it was, there go the Liberals again looking out for their friends in a Montreal-based even though there's bodies obviously all over the country, but it's a Montreal headquartered entity. So it was good for ratcheting up the old Quebec versus everyone else, or everyone else versus Quebec angle. Obviously, the Prime Minister lost some senior people on a day-to-day basis. That had a monster influence. But I think the other thing that it did to the Liberal Party of Canada is that one of Trudeau's things that he brought into the 2015 campaign was he brought in all these folks who came in from outside of the political establishment. Jody Wilson-Raybould was an example of that. Jane Philpott was a second example of that. And how the old way of doing things and the storylines, how they matched up. I didn't pressure her. There was lots of meetings. We sent in a bunch of folks. We said, do you have everything you need? That was kind of seen as the old Liberal way of quietly placing pressure on a decision maker. And there you had an outsider saying, I don't play that way. I make my own decisions. The decisions have been made. There's nothing more to talk about here. And obviously, those folks left the party. But I think they stand as an example of that whole outsider, like, I want to do things differently, Trudeau, of 2015. I think it really told a lot of people, or reinforced for a lot of people, is he really that different? Are things really changed in Ottawa? And I think Jody Wilson-Raybould showed that actually they're not too much different, even though it didn't kill Trudeau's government entirely in this past election.
How many legs would a dog have if you counted the tail as a leg? The answer is just 4. If this bill passes, governments and individual Canadians will be forced to call a tail a leg, nothing more.
I'm asking you whether you believe, as leader and as a father and a husband, whether you believe that women have the right to choose. I believe Canadians know that a Conservative government will not reopen this debate.
I am personally pro-life, but I've also made the commitment that as leader of this party, it is my responsibility to ensure that we do not reopen this debate.
People did not want to talk about women's reproductive rights, and yet that was thrust onto the agenda and hung around Andrew Scheer's neck like a stinking albatross, quite frankly.
Andrew has my support 100%.
Do you think caucus is sharing that mood?
We'll find out when we get there.
Do you believe that being gay is a sin?
No, look, we made it very clear during the election, in the last few months and years, our party is inclusive.
We cannot go in another electoral campaign with Andrew Scheer as our leader.
I think he should resign and run again for his job if he's confident that the party membership backs him.
I will be resigning as the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Coming in at number 2 of our top 5 political controversies, Conservative leader Andrew Scheer's stance on social issues. Let's start with you, Brad. This is quite the tale, I guess. When we initially we're thinking about the ideas, this was prior to Andrew Scheer resigning. He's now resigned. How big of a deal was this?
Well, it's a very big deal because it forced the leader of the opposition to resign. He obviously he had a leadership race that was scheduled for April of 2020, and there showed no signs of him doing well in that leadership vote. So stepping down was clearly the only option that he saw for himself. Look, you know that you're in trouble when you've alienated, conservatives who understand and respect full equal rights for the LGBTQ community and women's choice, and when you've got those people upset at you, and you've got the anti-choice and those that don't wish to extend equality rights, both mad at you, which is what Scheer ended up at the end of the campaign doing. He alienated both groups. Political parties are coalitions. It doesn't matter which party we're all describing. They're all coalitions. You got to keep the tent together. Mr. Scheer was unable to keep any aspect of the Conservative coalition together, and he had no ability to articulate his positions. Can you have the positions he had and still keep the Conservative coalition together? Maybe, but his inability to answer those questions adequately, I think, ultimately did him in.
Melissa, you wrote a really powerful op-ed prior to Mr. Scheer resigning about this very issue in the Globe and Mail. How much of a vulnerability was it for him during the campaign, and how significant might it be going forward for whomever replaces him?
Look, I think first off, I wouldn't conflate the two issues. In terms of reproductive rights and support for the LGBT community, I think they're very separate. I think the answers on them are very separate, and the issues themselves are, one I think is divisive, and the other one, frankly, is not. And I think that was the problem, is that you answered every single question in a way where Canadians didn't believe you on LGBT rights and protecting them as a prime minister. Look, I've said to a number of friends, it is harder to come out of the closet as gay in this city than it is to come out as an Andrew Scheer supporter. And that says something in terms of where the movement needs to go. But unlike the other controversies here, I think this one presents a world of opportunity. The Conservatives need to have a conversation, me included, about where our party is in 2020, where it is in 2022, in order to grow the tent, be aspirational, have a vision, and while keeping that tent together and respecting some of the views and the values in there. But I think on the LGBT question, it's a non-negotiable for me.
Vicky, how significant was this for Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives during the campaign?
I mean, I think it was hugely significant in that suggestions that had been made prior to the campaign that the Conservative Party was old and regressive and looked like our neighbors down south. I think some of that landed harder when he had to be more articulate about his positions. And I think during the elections, the Liberals successfully painted him as a specific type of conservative that you already know. And Andrew Scheer never stepped forward to really change the narrative on that or to really have a better answer. But at the same time, I think the question is always like, are we asking for someone to have a better and more eloquent answer on why they don't think women should have certain rights or why they don't believe in LGBTQ rights to a certain extent? I don't want a smarter, better thoughtful answer. I want a politician who's actually going to take action on those things. And so I think for Andrew Scheer, the articulation lent itself to the argument that he actually wasn't a believer or a supporter. Whether that's true, we still don't really know. But I think, he is where he is now, and he's heading out, and the party's going to have to contend with answering these questions because he's left them with it.
Amanda, I remember prior to the election, I think we did a panel in real life, I like to call it, not on TV. And I think you identified this as something that you thought would really, and not just specific to the Conservatives, but you thought the election would be about values of some type. The Liberals wanted it to be about that to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think Melissa paints a pretty shiny picture of what's possible, but I think it's a pretty shiny and an accurate picture. And the reason for that is because I think of all the political controversies we'll discuss today, this one has the biggest political consequence. Because if Andrew Scheer is the lightning rod, or if he's like the tip of the iceberg, what falls under him, the Conservative Party themselves and this wave of social conservatism that fell within it, is really the consequence. Anti-choice groups elected more MPs in the last election than ever before. So we have a huge problem on our hands in terms of women's reproductive rights, who's gonna stand for them and who's gonna stand against them. And that consequence to me, he may be wearing the stinking albatross across its neck, it's now the Conservative Party that wears that albatross.
So you don't think that they have an opportunity, as Melissa says, to acknowledge where Mr. Scheer fell short and then pick somebody who can, and like Vicky says, not just adequately answer those questions, but actually stand for something? Like on the choice thing, I mean, I think that lots of people in Canadian society think it's okay to hold the beliefs that you hold where abortion is concerned, but he was never really that clear about how he would act as Prime Minister or to what degree he would do to stop a debate or from emerging on that again.
Oh, he was clear as mud. It's the reason why he lost the election in many ways. It's the reason why he lost his job. But my point is, well, there may be an opportunity to now elect someone as a leader who holds views that are more in line, values that are more in line with Canadians writ large. They have a bigger problem in that there are more social conservatives in the mix than ever before, thanks to his views and thanks to the views that he was unable either to defend them or to deny them. So he left the party in a serious lurch.
Do you think that's true, Melissa?
Look, there are always going to be social conservatives in the mix. That's part of the party. It's part of the tent. But I would say to Amanda, why doesn't she ask her party why they're trying to make Rona Ambrose the ambassador to the U.S. If they're really not thinking about the Conservatives having a conversation that will take this party into a place where they can be victorious whenever the next election is.
Brad, you want to get in there?
Well, yeah, the next time the Conservatives choose their federal leader, they're going to be looking back at the Scheer era and repositioning themselves, because each time you pick a leader, you kind of look back in the near term, sometimes to the benefit of the future. But when I listen to Conservatives, across the country, they're wanting to course correct. That's why the pressure was on Mr. Scheer the whole time for him to resign. That's why there was very few people. Where was this? I mean, I know that Amanda and the Liberals like to keep the center left together by making the Conservative Party out scary, which I completely reject. Sometimes Conservatives can be scary, but they don't always have to be. The rights that have been fought and won over the last time. I remember fighting Liberals for years to get marriage equality in this country.
To be fair, they could articulate in the campaign how their views had evolved. Andrew Scheer could not.
Yeah, and I completely agree. So I'm just saying to you that I don't think it's as Amanda puts it. I think that the Conservatives can learn, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a national consensus like we do on so many things on these fundamental equality issues, and we can fight over the things that actually do divide us as a country, not these fundamental things that don't.
Last word to you, Vicky.
I mean, I think the two issues to me are wholly tied together at this very moment, because there are concerted pushes to make LGBTQ rights not a thing that is solid or make it a thing of the past. They are often overlapping and dovetailed with the movements to make abortion not something that women can access, let alone have a right to. The two come together, and it's an international movement that's happening, but we see its pockets in Canada. All of that requires political parties, especially and including the Conservative Party, who have this question before them, to really come up with an answer that works for Canadians and an answer that fits with our view of what is just.
And I dressed up in an Aladdin costume and put makeup on. I shouldn't have done that. I should have known better, but I didn't, and I'm really sorry.
That's the only time in your life you've ever done something like that.
When I was in high school, I dressed up at a talent show and sang Gale with makeup on.
Wearing brown face is an act of open mockery and racism. It was just as racist in 2001 as it is in 2019.
I have always acknowledged that I come from a place of privilege, but I now need to acknowledge that comes with a massive blind spot.
I'm surprised, and I was more surprised when I saw the number of times.
It was a sucker punch.
He is trying to blame this on society, that we must learn from this. No, Prime Minister, this is about you.
I don't want the conversation that I have with Mr. Trudeau to be used as a tool in his exoneration, or to be used as a way for him to say, I've had a conversation with a racialized leader and now I've done my job.
The racist history of blackface makes it wrong in any situation, in any circumstance.
The top political controversy of 2019, Justin Trudeau's blackface. Vicky, why don't I start with you? Your thoughts on this?
I'm surprised that anyone would really believe it was a top 5. I don't know that it actually publicly, I don't know that it registered other than for the controversy of it, but it will have, I don't know that it'll have a discernible effect. In fact, if you were to look, let's say, at the cabinet, there is not an increase in the number of black people inside that cabinet. If it's had an effect, I'm not sure that we're going to see that.
Melissa, what do you think?
Look, of course this was a controversy. It came down in the middle of an election, and it isn't just one time. It's 3 times that we know about. However, it speaks to the brand equity that the Prime Minister had built up, that something like this in the middle of an election campaign wasn't going to do the damage. I don't think we've seen necessarily the end of it. I think that he's on a shorter leash. I think that he took a lot of sort of political capital, or burned a lot of political capital on this one, and we'll see how that plays out when the government, who just made a commitment to winning that UN Security Council seat, we'll see how that plays out on the world stage. But in terms of big controversies, he still won the election. We call him Prime Minister today, even after 3 incidents of blackface.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Amanda, and I would say that for many conservatives who I spoke to after the outcome of this election, sort of the context of what the expectations were for their party and for the Liberals changed dramatically. First a bit with SNC, but then especially with the emergence of those photos. All of a sudden it became, they started saying they could win a majority, and then at the end of the day they were measured against that kind of expectation. Like people would just say, well, they couldn't even win against Justin Trudeau when he had these pictures type of thing. How did you view this controversy?
I mean, I remember saying that coming out of the election, saying, because for me personally, this was a very difficult one, and I didn't defend it publicly, and I felt like, well, I thought that the apology did feel sincere to me, and I thought the communication effort from Trudeau and the Liberals was better than I had seen it for a while, because it was decisive and it was quick and it was what they needed to do in the course of the election. I think a few things they had to their advantage. One was the fact that they had, Andrew Scheer, who was their big critique was coming from Andrew Scheer, and I don't think people believed him as the person who should be delivering that kind of critique, especially in the face of so many issues that he wasn't able to publicly defend. And I did say at the end that, if an issue like that, an issue that had domestic scale, it also had international scale, couldn't take down this prime minister, then, the Conservative Party was certainly doing something wrong, and they probably had the wrong guy at the helm, and turns out I was right.
Brad?
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I think that, in addition to Melissa's point on the brand strength, had this incident emerged earlier, i.e. in the middle of the 2015 campaign, would its effect on the Liberal vote have been more drastic? And I mean, obviously you can't go back in hindsight, but I make the assumption that it would have, because the period between 2015 and 2019, he built up that goodwill among so many Canadians who were, apologized on his behalf, sloughed it off and said everyone did it back then, or it was a long time ago and we should move on because we all made mistakes. In reality, though, if a candidate for the Liberal Party in 2019 had emerged with photos of blackface, they would have been cut from the slate in a heartbeat. I'm sure that would have happened certainly in the Democratic Party if the vet didn't catch it the first time, but I would submit also for the other parties. The other issue, though, that I think is right is that he survived it not only because he built up his brand, but because a lot of Canadians said, I don't want anybody else. He's the best we've got, and I'll take Trudeau with blackface over Scheer or Singh. Singh's numbers went up, and I completely agree with Amanda. When you watch the clips and listen to Andrew Scheer talk about racism, it falls flat and says, I don't think that's got any credibility. He's trying to take advantage. Jagmeet Singh, on the other hand, obviously is the only racialized leader of a major political party. You saw that while his votes went down and his seat count went down, his personal popularity went up. And I think a lot of people looked at Mr. Singh differently, gave him another closer look and said, well, he's popular, his approval numbers are very, they went up significantly after this incident. Wasn't enough to bridge the gap between leader approval and seats. But obviously there's something there for Mr. Singh in the future. But as it said, it wasn't enough to bring down Trudeau, but it certainly hurt the brand. He's got more humility today, I think, for a lot of reasons. And I don't think he's got the majority. This is a part of it. But he still survived to be the prime minister, which says something about the competition.
Do you think, Vicky, that that it's you mentioned that you didn't see it reflected in real action, but do you think it's being reflected at all through the way in which the prime minister communicates, or anything really?
Again, no, because, we haven't seen, there are no more Black cabinet ministers represented. We haven't seen him take on more issues to do with the Black community, and that's not for a lack of request and for a lack of action required. I still don't know that before or after we saw a substantial change in how they were going to approach the Black communities, but racialized communities as a whole. Think, for example, their answer on Bill 21 in Quebec. If you don't see that as affecting Black, Muslim, Somali women in Quebec, that's not a response to what blackface. Apologies require actual action taken after the fact, and we're still not seeing that from this government. We're seeing their standard sets of responses, but nothing that suggests that he's going to, take extraordinary steps to reconcile with the communities hurt by blackface.
Melissa, what do you think?
Look, for the Liberals, I think that it taught them probably a lesson in not putting Justin Trudeau at the center of everything. I think now we see Minister Freeland, who is the minister of everything, and then maybe the Prime Minister taking a back seat and a lesson in humility. I think for the Conservatives, it taught them a lesson that, you know, not everybody hates Justin Trudeau as much as Conservatives do, and frankly, I think you have to look at that. And part of that is brand strength. Part of that is sort of that boy wonder vibe that started in 2015 and that he managed to sustain for the most part over the 4 years. So a lot of lessons learned in this one, none of which could be explained in a textbook of why someone who wears blackface 3 times still ends up the Prime Minister in the next election. That one's a head scratcher, and it'll be discussed for a long, long time.
Amanda, this is, I mean, we know that the Liberals still won this controversy, the SNC-Lavalin one. How do you think, what kind of lessons, do you think there are any lessons learned for the Prime Minister? Are you seeing that reflected to any degree, for example, vis-a-vis what both Melissa and Brad have referred to as a bit more humility, the way in which he conducts himself? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I do. And I think that there's a more careful consideration when it comes to communication. I think this was a government that saw, you know, it was like a scathed free 3 years where not a lot happened. There weren't a lot of controversies, and they were pretty unprepared when it came to dealing with a scandal of the magnitude of SNC or this issue. So I think that they did learn that lesson. I do think that there is a humility to the way that he's approaching communications. And I think that these are early days in the second mandate. So there's an opportunity that exists for him, for the government, to show how prepared they are to take the step in the right direction, as Vicky was referencing.
Brad?
No, I agree. I think that the communications on that was much better than some of those other crisis comms, particularly SNC-Lavalin, where the story changed. I thought he came across somewhat authentic during that apology. And the country, by and large, those that were with him at the time, stayed with him. And I even submit that he actually probably gained some over that. So I think that there was a lot learned. Whether or not we see, like, I'm not disagreeing that the government should learn and act in a policy manner, but I certainly haven't seen anything like that. I think that the tone of working together in Parliament in the upcoming year and a bit could be all part of that as well. But again, he's got to fight. He's got to constantly fight against the notion, which is out there just under the surface, that there's one set of rules for him and there's another set of rules for everyone else. And as long as he stays on the right side of that, he'll avoid more of that brand eating away of the brand strength that he's built up.
All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our very special Power panel tonight, Amanda Alvaro, Vicky Machama, Melissa Lantsman, and Brad Levine. And that is it for this very special Top 5 Controversy edition of Power in Politics. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.